You step lightly over the marble floor of the royal palace of Madrid, yet each footfall echoes as if the walls themselves remember centuries of whispered secrets. The air smells faintly of dust, wax, and faded perfume, clinging to the gilded draperies like a memory of power. You pass portrait after portrait, each king's eyes following you, serene yet accusing, and you can almost hear their silent verdicts. Blood will betray blood, and crowns will not forgive weakness. Before we continue into the shadowed corridors of history, take a moment to join this journey together. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden, often dark truths of the past, click that like button and subscribe for more immersive history. Drop a comment below to let me know where you are watching from. I am constantly amazed by the way these stories connect viewers from Istanbul to Lima, Tokyo to Lagos, as if centuries of time collapse into one shared curiosity. Here, together, we wander through the corridors of memory and human ambition. Ferdinand VII entered the world on October 14, 1784, within the stately yet suffocating walls of the royal palace, born to Charles IV of Spain and Maria Luisa of Parma. His arrival, ostensibly a cause for celebration, carried a weight far heavier than that of a mere heir. The crown he was destined to wear had long been tainted by generations of calculated marriages within the family, first cousins, uncles, nieces, all designed to preserve power, lineage, and territory. Yet this careful preservation of bloodlines came with an invisible toll, a genetic inheritance as cruel and unyielding as the throne itself. From his earliest days, Ferdinand was not simply a child of privilege. His body bore subtle marks of the lineage's hidden curse, anomalies whispered about by court physicians and the palace staff, but never spoken aloud beyond the thick walls of the nursery. His mind, too, seemed to absorb the subtle atmosphere of suspicion and control, learning from infancy that one's personal flaws could be weaponized against you, even by those who swore loyalty. In this environment, laughter was a threat, glance a betrayal, and silence could hide a dagger poised to strike. The palace itself seemed complicit in his slow awakening to the cruel realities of royalty. The tapestries, woven with scenes of conquest and triumph, contrasted sharply with the oppressive weight of expectation that pressed upon him. Servants scurried like shadows across cold stone corridors, muttering under their breath, their eyes flicking nervously to the young prince. Even the sunlight streaming through tall windows fell unevenly, casting long, trembling shadows that crept along the floor, a visual reminder that light and life within these walls were tempered by fear and secrecy. By the age of 6, Ferdinand displayed the quiet, watchful temperament that would later define him as king. Tutors noted a precocious understanding of strategy and intrigue, yet there were moments when his body betrayed him, moments that seemed almost a cruel joke of fate. Whispers traveled quickly through the palace corridors. The prince's health was fragile, his constitution delicate, and certain physical peculiarities had already begun to draw concerned attention. How could a child be expected to command armies or govern territories when he was himself a puzzle of flesh and nerve, a fragile instrument in a symphony of dynastic expectation? The court's response was a mixture of fascination and dread. Physicians, cloaked in black, observed him with meticulous attention, recording anomalies in hushed Latin notation. One doctor, in a letter later discovered in a forgotten archive, described the boy's growth with a clinical precision that could not mask the unease beneath. His form is a mirror of the family's hidden burdens, both in body and mind. Nature herself seems to conspire against the crown. The words, intended for private eyes only, seemed to resonate within the palace, an echo that would follow Ferdinand into adulthood. Even as a boy, Ferdinand began learning the subtle arts of concealment and projection. He noticed how courtiers smiled politely while their eyes gleamed with curiosity or veiled ridicule. He learned to move with calculated poise, to observe before speaking, and to internalize humiliation as both armor and weapon. The seeds of paranoia were sown not through cruelty alone, but through careful, deliberate exposure to the court's ceaseless scrutiny. Every whispered remark, every glance, every seemingly innocuous gesture became a lesson in survival. By the time Ferdinand reached adolescence, the full intersection of his body and psyche was evident. He was heir to a kingdom, yet he carried within him the silent inheritance of a family's private curse. Every step in the palace, every encounter with a tutor or servant, reinforced the inescapable truth. Power alone would not protect him from the scrutiny and judgment that would define his life. The crown on his head would be heavy, yes, but the weight of his secret, his anomalous body and mind, would press more heavily still. And so the boy who would become king grew in silence and shadow, observed by those who whispered behind closed doors, marked by the invisible hand of heredity, and slowly shaped into a man whose private insecurities would one day ripple outward to touch an entire nation. In the silent corridors of Madrid, the crown's curse waited patiently, as if biding its time, for the moment when history would reveal the full measure of its dark inheritance. The door closes behind you with a soft thud, and the room exhales centuries of secrets. Candlelight flickers over the silk-draped walls, casting shadows that twist like living things, hinting at both desire and dread. You sense the weight of expectation in the air, thick as the musk that clings to the curtains, as if the very fabric of the room remembers the terror and obsession that unfolded here. Ferdinand VII, now a man, entered this chamber not as a boy hidden behind tutors and courtiers, but as a king burdened with private insecurities and public obligations. Before we peer behind these curtains together, consider joining a community that travels these hidden corridors of history with the same relentless curiosity. Hit like and subscribe if you feel drawn into the dark truths of the past, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. There is something extraordinary in knowing that across continents, from Buenos Aires to Berlin, viewers gather to witness the same shadows, the same echoes, the same whispered secrets of time. The royal marriage, designed as a theatrical display of dynastic unity and political stability, quickly revealed fissures that no public spectacle could conceal. Ferdinand's bride, Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, arrived with the innocence of youth, her dress trailing like sunlight across the polished floor, her mind alive with visions of courtly romance. But the veneer of ceremony could not mask the private horrors awaiting her. The young king's anatomical anomalies, long whispered about by court physicians and servants alike, collided violently with the ritualized demands of royal consummation. From the moment of their first night, the palace witnessed a scene that would later be recalled in hushed letters and private diaries as both tragic and grotesque. Special cushions and medical contrivances, crafted in secret workshops by artisans sworn to silence, were arranged around the bed. Oils and elixirs promised to ease the ritual, filled silver basins and sent the air with bitter herb and faintly cloying perfume. Maria Antonia, though trained in the etiquette of queenship, recoiled at the scale of what she was asked to endure. One lady-in-waiting later wrote of her mistress's first encounter. Her screams were not those of passion, but of disbelief, of terror, as if the very bed had become an instrument of judgment. Ferdinand, already deeply insecure and obsessed with producing an heir, approached these encounters with the precision of a surgeon rather than the tenderness of a husband. The physicians who attended noted his obsessive concern for the mechanics of his condition, how the body could be supported, how pain might be mitigated, how the ritual could be completed without catastrophic injury to either party. Yet their presence, intended to safeguard, only magnified the horror, transforming intimacy into a publicized, almost clinical performance. The psychological consequences for both were devastating. Maria Antonia, initially vivacious and curious, grew pale and withdrawn, her laughter replaced with trembling silence. Her letters, carefully concealed, spoke of nights when she felt trapped in her own chambers, the walls closing around her like the very instruments designed to maintain royal order. Ferdinand, for his part, became increasingly consumed with suspicion, believing that any hesitation, any recoil, any sign of distress was a personal affront and a threat to the continuation of his dynasty. How could a man reconcile love, duty, and the grotesque limitations of his own body? Court physicians documented in careful Latin the measures taken to preserve both the king's dignity and the life of the queen. They described beds with adjustable supports, oils blended from rare substances, and ritualistic sequences repeated like choreography. Yet even these efforts could not disguise the growing trauma, nor the strain on the palace's hierarchy as staff witnessed the unfolding suffering and speculated about its cause. Some whispered that the king's obsession with heredity, combined with his body's unnatural proportions, had created a private theater of cruelty that would haunt both royal lines and the history of the Spanish monarchy. By the end of the first year of marriage, Maria Antonia's health had begun to fail, both in body and spirit. She experienced fainting spells, sleepless nights, and what physicians delicately termed melancholia of the constitution. Ferdinand, desperate to fulfill his duty as king, persisted with the same obsessive regimen, consulting astrologers, foreign physicians, and apothecaries, seeking remedies that would render the ritual successful. Each failure deepened his paranoia, and each sign of distress from the queen fueled a cycle of obsession, medical intervention, and psychological terror. What began as an intimate duty transformed into a cruel public spectacle, observed by a court that balanced awe, fear, and moral outrage. Letters from visiting diplomats hint at a private knowledge of the king's struggles, but they couched their words in diplomacy, reporting merely that His Majesty approaches all matters of state with singular intensity. Behind these formalities, however, the palace itself became a laboratory of obsession, the bedchamber a stage where the personal horrors of the king and queen unfolded for the careful eyes of physicians, courtiers, and, ultimately, history itself. As years passed without a successful heir, the shadow of the bedchamber stretched outward, contaminating both governance and dynasty. The psychological weight borne by Maria Antonia and Ferdinand would leave indelible marks, forging patterns of cruelty, obsession, and secrecy that would define the king's reign. And in the darkened corners of the palace, where candle flames guttered and musk lingered, one could almost hear the whispers of a question that would haunt Spain for decades. Could a crown built on secrets and ritual survive the weight of its own shadow? The sunlight falls unevenly through the tall windows of Madrid's corridors, gilding frescoed ceilings with a false warmth. You can almost hear the murmurs of courtiers echoing against marble floors, whispers of betrayal and ambition that seem to cling to the gilded moldings themselves. Every ornate doorway, every polished banister conceals secrets that only the crown knows, and every shadow seems to ask the same haunting question: who truly wields power, and at what cost? When Ferdinand VII ascended the throne, he brought with him more than a royal title. He carried the weight of years spent navigating humiliation, obsession, and private terror, each personal wound transmuted into a tool of governance. The boy, who had once recoiled from scrutiny, now commanded with an intensity shaped by fear and an unyielding desire to control. The throne, it seemed, had not tamed him. It had amplified the very insecurities that had haunted his youth. Ferdinand's court became a stage upon which paranoia was law. Courtiers learned quickly to measure every word, every gesture, for the king's memory was long and his suspicion deeper than any moat surrounding the palace. Dissenters, or those deemed careless, faced swift retribution. Ambassadors reported with careful diplomacy, yet behind the curtains, stories of imprisonment, exile, and mysterious disappearances circulated. The king's personal humiliations, the knowledge that his body and reputation were objects of secret ridicule, had become instruments of terror, shaping his subjects' behavior as effectively as any decree. The obsession with heirs, long ingrained during his tormented marriages, became a national preoccupation. Ferdinand commissioned intricate schemes, consulting physicians, alchemists, and astrologers alike, determined to secure the continuation of his lineage. These efforts were not simply private, they intersected with politics, influencing alliances and courtly favor. A queen's ability, or inability, to bear children became a measure of loyalty, a test of devotion, and, in Ferdinand's mind, a reflection of her moral and political worth. The machinery of reproduction, once intimate, now served the machinery of state. Public ceremonies of celebration masked a private world of coercion and fear. Festivals, parades, and royal audiences displayed the king's power and charisma, yet they concealed the meticulous control he exercised over every interaction. Every smile could conceal conspiracy. Every congratulatory word might hide mockery. The streets of Madrid, vibrant with life and color, trembled beneath an invisible tension, as citizens and courtiers alike learned that the whims of a fearful and obsessive monarch could shape their fates with ruthless precision. Ferdinand's political maneuvers, fueled by personal insecurities, created ripples that extended far beyond the palace. Colonies in revolt, nobles plotting, and foreign powers watching keenly found in the king a leader whose decisions were inseparable from his anxieties. Purges of ministers, manipulations of elections, and suppression of dissent all bore the signature of a man whose private humiliation had hardened into policy. The very machinery of governance reflected his inner life, a mixture of obsession, cruelty, and meticulous calculation. Yet, even as his reign grew in terror and spectacle, Ferdinand could not escape the fragility of the human condition. His obsession with secrecy, heirs, and control was inseparable from vulnerability. The crown may have granted him authority, but it could not shield him from the shadows of fear that stalked every decision. His reign, immortalized in history as tyrannical and capricious, was at its heart a story of a man forged by private torment, whose personal fragilities reshaped a nation. By the time Ferdinand VII's power reached its zenith, the palace was a labyrinth of suspicion, the streets of Madrid alive with the subtle pulse of apprehension, and Spain itself caught in the inescapable gravity of a king who had turned fear into law. He had transformed personal humiliation into public tyranny, obsession into policy, and paranoia into governance. And though decades have passed, the legacy of Ferdinand's reign lingers in the history of a nation, a shadow beneath the splendor of crowns and thrones, reminding all who study it that human frailty, even in the highest station, can shape the destiny of millions.